With the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing, Michael Sukkar. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Hi, Chris. Good to be with you.
I want to get to the tax cuts, argy-bargy, in just a moment. But first up in your portfolio of housing, pretty encouraging signs today. The first time in in a couple of years, I think, that we've seen an increase in housing prices. Only a marginal one, 0.1%, I think, in Sydney and 0.2% in Melbourne, or vice versa. But the first signs that we're actually starting to see a turnaround in the housing market?
Yeah, Chris, I think there are some signs of green shoots. I think we've got to be cautious about it, but certainly since the election, I think there's been renewed optimism around the housing market, and certainly seeing capital city prices not reducing for another month is encouraging, because in the end, let's remember, for most people, their single biggest asset, where the majority of their wealth is contained, is in the value of their home. So it's always good for us to see certainly stable, at the very least, housing prices. So seeing those green shoots, Chris, is encouraging.
Yeah, the Reserve Bank is meeting again tomorrow, and there's a lot of speculation that the cash rate will be dropped yet again. Well,
Chris, there's always a lot of speculation around RBA decisions. As you know, they're independent of the government, so we will be, like everybody else, watching what the RBA does. I think there's certainly some reasons to be optimistic about where the economy is going, with also being realistic about the headwinds in front of us, which is why our tax cuts are so important, and which is why we are telling the Labor Party very plainly and very clearly this week that don't stand in the way of giving millions of Australians income tax relief, because it's not just important for those individuals, those millions of Australians who will be receiving those cheques, but also the broader strength of the economy as well.
I'll come back to those tax cuts in a moment. It is the issue of the week. But I want to get you put a question without notice to you now. It's just come up in the last 15 minutes on this program. We've been speaking to Ian Henschke from the National Seniors Group, and he's focusing on deeming rates. Now, we're talking about low interest rates, a cash rate of 1.25 at the moment, possibly going lower. We're told that bank deposits, the best rate you can get these days is about 2%. Yet you still have a deeming rate in place for pensioners with over 50,000 in savings of 3.25%. And Ian Henschke is saying this is effectively a tax on pensioners, on retirees. Is that deeming rate too high, and when can the government do something about it?
Well, Chris, look, the issue around deeming rates, there's always a lag between current interest rates and deeming rates, which are set at a point in time. Obviously, in the lead up to the election, we fought very hard to protect the seniors that your previous guest was presumably representing, in protecting their franking credits. So like all these issues, we'll look at them with good faith and how we can assist, but I would leave it to another day to discuss that, given that the importance of tax cuts, I think, Chris, are really the primary agenda of this week, and what should rightly be taking up all the airtime of our discussions.
Yeah, tax cuts are not particularly important for pensioners, though, and the deeming rate does affect them. As you say, it is a question without notice, and let's have a look at it in more detail in the future. But just, is it something that the government can actually fix quickly, or is this something that has to happen inside a budget and therefore you can't really address till next year's budget?
Well, Chris, like all of these sorts of questions, we will always look at these things in an orderly fashion. As I said to you, this is not a new issue. There's a perennial issue around deeming rates, because you have deeming rates set at a particular point in time, and as you know, interest rates fluctuate quite drastically, and we are in a low interest rate environment, indeed have been in a low interest rate environment for really the last decade. So these issues are not particularly new, and we will look at all good proposals, no doubt, but it will be done in an orderly fashion, as you would expect.
Well, as you mentioned, the deeming rates need to fluctuate. There hasn't been a change for over 4 years. We do have record low interest rates. Could you make the observation then, at least, that a 3.25% deeming rate seems high given our current interest rate environment?
Chris, look, no doubt recognise the issues that have been raised, and we've seen them being raised over the last few weeks. We are always sympathetic to these sorts of issues, and the government, as I said, in an orderly way will address it. But this is not a particularly new issue, as you're aware. This is a perennial issue, and obviously in a low interest rate environment, as we've been in for the last decade, it's a heightened issue for many people. But that's also one of the reasons why we fought so hard before the election and indeed ran a campaign protecting seniors' refundable franking credits, because we know for many seniors the way that they can obtain higher returns than the cash rate or a term deposit, for example, is by investing in Australian shares, and that's why franking credits are so important, because it enables them to augment their returns. And so in that sense, I think the government has a very good story to tell and is indicative to those people that of course we're sympathetic to the returns that retirees are after. But like all of these issues, we will look at them and deal with them in an orderly fashion.
Well, let's get back to the tax cuts agenda. Now, you've got the power of the argument, the power of the election victory, the mandate of the people behind you when it comes to this issue. But how far will you be prepared to go? If you don't split the bill and you don't get the crossbench support, you're happy to see Labor actually vote this down in the Senate and hold your ground?
Well, Chris, I think there's a couple of hypotheticals there. We're absolutely determined to do what we said we would do before the election, and I think you and many other commentators would rightly criticise us if we didn't seek to faithfully implement what we spoke about day in and day out. And it's quite extraordinary that the Labor Party think they know better than the Australian people. The Labor Party have not moved on from their high taxing agenda. You've got the Shadow Treasurer, who really is the joint architect of all of those crazy taxes that the Labor Party put forward before the election, and they are not willing to let them go. So, look, our view, Chris, is we are steadfast in our support for those millions of Australians who are really looking forward to these tax cuts. I've spoken about the importance that they represent to those millions of individuals, but also the importance that it represents to the confidence of the economy. So we take this very seriously. We are not surprised, but I suppose disappointed that the Labor Party has taken the approach. They are hopelessly divided on this, and indeed we saw yesterday Senator Gallagher talking about outsourcing their tax policy to the crossbenchers, which is even probably one of the more extraordinary things we've seen from the Labor Party since the election. But here we are determined to faithfully implement what we said to the Australian people that we would put in place when re-elected.
Now, we've heard Matthias Cormann say previously, obviously the finance minister and plays a crucial role in the Senate, he's been saying that he's not interested in negotiating with those crossbenchers, that the legislation package is just going up to the Senate and there's no room for argy-bargy with the crossbench. Is that still the case, or are you looking at speaking to the crossbench, seeing exactly what they want in return for passage of this tax plan?
Well, I don't think Matthias ever suggested he wouldn't be speaking to the crossbenchers.
Sure,
I think,
he was not negotiating with them.
You know, those conversations occur. Look, I don't think Australians want to see any sort of tawdry horse trading, which of course we wouldn't engage in anyway. I think it's always important to speak to the crossbenchers as to the plans, why they are so important. I mean, it's disappointing that we have to rely on the crossbench. You'd think after an election like this, the Labor Party would show some responsibility as a major party, some responsibility to the Australian people and their verdict. But having said that, we are not surprised by Labor's approach, their high taxing, high spending approach, which has not changed one iota since the election. So I think it's ordinary, and you'd expect, Chris, that we would be speaking to the crossbenchers, explaining to them the virtues of our policies. It'll start with tax. Tax will be the most important, but I suspect that'll be a feature of all of our policies, particularly when you've got a Labor Party who has reverted so far back in an economic sense that they can't be relied on to support sensible economic policies as they once were. And that will make the crossbenchers even more important. In some respects, sadly, because you'd think that tax cuts for millions of Australians, up to $1,080 for an individual, $2,160 for a dual income family, that they would accept needs to be delivered this week and that we wouldn't have to be engaging in these discussions with the crossbench. But sadly, that's where we are, and we are absolutely determined to make sure we deliver upon it.
Just finally, Michael, your thoughts on the new Governor-General addressing the chamber in Ngunnawal language?
Look, I congratulated the Prime Minister on the announcement some time ago. I think he's somebody who will do that position proud, somebody with an immaculate history, an immaculate track record in their service to our country, and addressing the chamber in the Ngunnawal language, I think, is a very symbolic and nice statement. And again, you know, the role of a position like Governor-General is to bring Australians together. And I think, just like Peter Cosgrove, will do the position absolute justice.
Michael Sukkar, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Chris.